A warm breeze carried the scent of rain as Elijah hurried down the bustling city street, his mind clouded with frustration. Life had been nothing but a relentless cycle of disappointment, a never-ending loop of broken dreams and unfulfilled promises. He had once believed in greatness, in his ability to make a difference, but years of struggle had chipped away at his confidence. His job at the local bookstore barely covered the rent, and his passion for writing, once a burning fire, had faded into nothing more than a forgotten whisper. He stuffed his hands into his worn-out jacket pockets, sighing as he glanced at his watch. Late again. His boss, Mr. Hamilton, a gruff yet kind-hearted man in his 60s, would surely have something to say about it. Elijah quickened his pace, weaving through the crowd, barely noticing the world around him. That was until he heard the faint cry. It was so soft, almost drowned by the noise of the city, but something about it made him stop. He turned his head toward a dark alleyway between two old buildings, the kind most people avoided without a second thought. Hesitating, he took a step forward, peering into the shadows. There, curled up against the cold brick wall, was a young girl. She couldn't have been older than 10. Her clothes were tattered, her face streaked with dirt, and her eyes, large and filled with an unspoken sadness, locked onto his. Elijah felt his heart clench. He had seen homeless people before, but something about her small frame, the way she held her knees to her chest, struck a chord deep within him. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer. "Hey there," he said gently, kneeling before her. "Are you okay?" The girl flinched slightly but didn't move away. She studied him with wary eyes before finally shaking her head. Elijah glanced around, hoping to spot someone who might be looking for her, but the street remained indifferent, people walking by without a second glance. "Where are your parents?" he asked. She lowered her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gone." A sharp pang of sorrow rippled through Elijah. He had lost his own mother years ago, and though it wasn't the same, he understood the depth of loneliness in that single word. He ran a hand through his hair, debating his next move. He wasn't exactly in a position to help anyone, his own life was in shambles, but he couldn't just walk away. "Are you hungry?" he finally asked. The girl hesitated, then nodded. Without another word, Elijah stood and held out his hand. She hesitated for only a moment before slipping her small, fragile fingers into his. He felt a strange sense of purpose settle over him as he led her out of the alley. They walked in silence until they reached a small diner a few blocks away. It wasn't much, just a cozy place with red booths and the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. Elijah found a corner booth and motioned for her to sit. The waitress, an older woman named Marge who had known Elijah for years, raised an eyebrow at his unexpected companion but said nothing as she handed them menus. "Order whatever you want," he told the girl. She hesitated, scanning the menu with careful eyes before quietly requesting a grilled cheese sandwich. Elijah added a bowl of soup for himself, watching as she fidgeted with the silverware. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma," she replied, her voice still soft. "Emma," he repeated, smiling slightly. "That's a nice name." She didn't smile back, but something in her posture relaxed ever so slightly. Their food arrived, and Elijah watched as she ate slowly, savoring each bite as if she weren't sure when her next meal would come. He didn't press her with questions, she had been through enough. Instead, he simply sat with her, letting the silence speak for itself. As the days passed, Elijah found himself unable to shake the thought of Emma. He had taken her to a shelter that first night, but something about the way she had clung to his hand before he left haunted him. She had no one, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt responsible for her. So he kept going back, visiting her, making sure she was eating, bringing her books from the store where he worked. At first, she was quiet, reserved, but slowly, she started opening up. She told him about the nights she spent sleeping in bus stations, the way people looked through her as if she were invisible. She had been alone for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. One evening, as they sat in the park, she turned to him and asked, "Why are you helping me?" Elijah stared at the sky, watching as the first stars blinked into existence. "Because someone should," he said simply. She was silent for a long moment before whispering, "No one ever has before." Something inside Elijah shifted that night. He had spent so long feeling lost, believing he had no purpose. But Emma had given him one. He didn't have much, but he had enough to make a difference in at least one life. Determined to do more, he began researching the foster system, learning about adoption laws, talking to people who might help. It wasn't easy, the process was long and exhausting, but he refused to give up. Mr. Hamilton, who had always sensed the deeper struggle within Elijah, offered him more hours at the bookstore. Marge at the diner helped spread the word about Emma, raising small donations to help with legal fees. Slowly but surely, the impossible began to seem possible. The day he finally gained legal guardianship of Emma, he could hardly believe it. She stood beside him at the courthouse, gripping his hand tightly as the judge finalized the paperwork. "She's yours now," the judge said with a small smile. Elijah looked down at Emma, who met his gaze with tear-filled eyes. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked softly. She nodded. For the first time in years, a genuine smile broke across her face. That night, as they sat on the couch in their small apartment, Emma curled up beside him with a book in her hands, Elijah realized something profound. He had spent so long searching for purpose, waiting for his life to change, not realizing that the change had found him instead. Sometimes, the most unexpected moments hold the power to redefine everything. And in that moment, with Emma beside him, he knew his life had changed forever. The cold wind bit against Aaron's skin as he stepped out of the job interview, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Another rejection. Another polite nod from the hiring manager who had already made up their mind before he even walked through the door. He had lost count of how many times he had heard the same words, "We appreciate your time, but we've chosen another candidate." It was becoming a script, one he could recite in his sleep. His legs felt heavy as he walked toward the bus stop, his shoulders slumping under the weight of disappointment. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had graduated with honors, followed all the right steps, yet here he was, jobless, nearly broke, and drowning in self-doubt. His friends had moved on, securing jobs, building careers, but he felt stuck, as if life had placed him in an invisible prison where every effort led to the same dead end. The bus ride home was long, giving him too much time to think. He stared out the window, watching the city blur past him, wondering where he had gone wrong. His parents had always believed in him, especially his mother, who used to say, "The hardest roads lead to the best destinations." But right now, all he saw were closed doors. As he stepped into his tiny apartment, the silence greeted him like an old enemy. Bills sat unopened on the counter, reminders of the reality he was desperately trying to escape. He sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair before collapsing onto the couch. Maybe he wasn't good enough. Maybe he was chasing a dream that wasn't meant for him. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of failure grew heavier. His savings dwindled, forcing him to take whatever odd jobs he could find, delivering groceries, working night shifts at a warehouse, anything to keep the lights on. Each rejection email felt like a punch to the gut, but he kept applying, kept hoping that maybe, just maybe, the next one would be different. Then, one night, as he was scrolling through job listings, he came across an ad for a sales position at a small tech startup. It wasn't his dream job, but it was something. With nothing to lose, he submitted his application, expecting nothing in return. To his surprise, he received a call the next morning. The manager, a man named Daniel, had read his resume and was impressed by his persistence despite his lack of experience in sales. "We don't need perfection," Daniel had said. "We need people who don't give up." Aaron took the job, grateful for a chance to prove himself. But the real struggle had only just begun. The first few weeks were brutal. Sales wasn't something he had ever done before, and rejection was even more personal when it came from customers who barely spared him a second glance. He fumbled through calls, stumbled over pitches, and doubted himself more times than he could count. But then something changed. One evening, after yet another failed attempt at closing a deal, Daniel pulled him aside. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "You think too much about what you're going to say instead of listening. Sales isn't about convincing people, it's about understanding them." That night, Aaron thought about those words. Maybe his struggles weren't just about finding a job. Maybe they were about learning something deeper, how to connect, how to grow, how to adapt. The next day, he tried a different approach. Instead of focusing on making a sale, he focused on the person in front of him. He listened, asked questions, and for the first time, he felt something click. The conversations felt natural, and to his astonishment, he made his first successful sale. One sale turned into 2, then 3, then 10. The more he pushed through, the more he learned. He realized that struggle wasn't a sign of failure but a necessary part of growth. Months passed, and Aaron transformed. The same man who once doubted himself now walked into meetings with confidence. He became one of the top performers in the company, not because he was the best, but because he refused to quit when things were hard. Then, one day, he received an unexpected call. It was from a prestigious company he had once applied to and been rejected from. They had seen his recent work and were now offering him a position. As he sat in that familiar interview chair, facing the same kind of hiring manager who once turned him away, he realized something: the rejection, the failures, the struggle, they weren't setbacks. They were the very things that had shaped him into someone better, someone stronger. And for the first time in a long time, he was grateful for every hardship that had led him here. The rain poured relentlessly as Maya tightened her thin scarf around her neck, bracing against the cold wind. The city was unforgiving on nights like these, where the streets emptied, and people hurried to the warmth of their homes, leaving behind those who had no doors to walk through. She had been one of them once, a face in the crowd, unseen, unheard. But tonight, she wasn't walking these streets as a victim, she was here with a purpose. Maya stopped by a small cafe and peered inside. It was warm and bright, filled with laughter and the comforting scent of coffee. A stark contrast to the night outside. She shook off the cold and pushed the door open, the small bell above jingling as she stepped in. The owner, Mr. Patel, looked up from behind the counter, his face lighting up with recognition. "Maya. Out in this weather again?" he asked, already reaching for a cup to pour her usual tea. She smiled, shaking her head. "Not for me. I was wondering if you had anything extra today." Mr. Patel's gaze softened. He knew why she was here. Without a word, he packed some sandwiches and a container of soup, handing them over without hesitation. "You have a kind heart," he said. "But don't forget to take care of yourself too." Maya nodded, grateful, but she had learned long ago that kindness was not about what was easy. It was about doing what was right, even when the world wasn't watching. She stepped back into the cold, her hands clutching the warm bag of food. A few blocks down, nestled against the wall of an old bookstore, she found him. The man was huddled in a thin blanket, his hands trembling from the cold. He had been there for weeks now, always too proud to ask for help but never refusing when it was given. "Hey, David," Maya said softly, kneeling beside him. "I brought something warm." His tired eyes lifted, a flicker of gratitude shining through the exhaustion. "You're an angel," he muttered as she handed him the soup. She sat with him as he ate, not saying much. Sometimes, silence was enough. Maya knew what it felt like to be ignored, to feel invisible. Years ago, after losing her parents in an accident, she had been tossed into a world that didn't care if she survived. She had slept on cold sidewalks, endured nights of hunger, and fought the urge to give up. But through it all, one thing had kept her going: kindness. A stranger had once given her a warm coat when she had nothing but rags. Another had paid for a meal when she hadn't eaten in days. Those small acts had become the foundation of her resilience. Determined to break the cycle, Maya had found work at a shelter, helping others the way she had been helped. She had learned that strength wasn't just about surviving hardships, it was about refusing to let them harden your heart. David finished his meal, his hands now steadier. "Why do you keep helping people like me?" he asked, his voice gruff but curious. Maya smiled. "Because I know what it's like to be where you are." His gaze held hers for a long moment before he nodded. "Maybe one day, I'll be the one helping someone else." She squeezed his shoulder. "That's how it works." As Maya walked away, her heart felt full. Kindness didn't cost much, but it had the power to change lives. And resilience? It wasn't just about enduring pain, it was about using that pain to build something better. And in that moment, she knew she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, changing the world one small act at a time. The sun was setting behind the city skyline, casting golden hues across the streets as Daniel walked toward the small bookstore where his journey had truly begun. It had been years since he first stepped through those doors as a lost young man, struggling to find his way. Now, as he reached for the handle, he couldn't help but reflect on the lessons that had shaped him into the person he had become. Back then, Daniel had been drowning in self-doubt. He had just lost his job, his savings were dwindling, and every rejection letter he received felt like another nail in the coffin of his dreams. He had spent months applying for positions he wasn't passionate about, hoping for a chance to prove himself, but each closed door only deepened his frustration. One particularly cold evening, after another unsuccessful interview, he had wandered into the old bookstore simply to escape the harsh wind. The place smelled of aged paper and fresh coffee, a quiet sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. An elderly man behind the counter, Mr. Thompson, had greeted him with a kind smile. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," Mr. Thompson had remarked. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just one of those days." The older man nodded knowingly and gestured to the rows of books. "You know, every great story has struggles. It's how the characters grow. Life's the same way." Daniel had scoffed at the time, unable to see past his own failures. But something about those words lingered in his mind. He started visiting the bookstore regularly, reading stories of resilience, courage, and transformation. Slowly, he realized that failure wasn't the end, it was part of the journey. With newfound determination, Daniel stopped applying for jobs that didn't inspire him. Instead, he pursued his passion for writing. He started a blog, sharing his experiences of struggle and perseverance. At first, no one noticed, but he kept writing, not for validation but because it gave him purpose. Then, one day, an email changed everything. A publishing company had stumbled upon his blog and was interested in his work. They saw something in his words: honesty, resilience, and the raw truth of someone who had faced failure and refused to let it define him. Now, standing in the bookstore years later, Daniel realized how much had changed. His book was displayed in the window, a testament to the journey he had taken. Mr. Thompson was still behind the counter, his wise eyes twinkling as he spotted Daniel. "You made it," he said with a proud smile. Daniel nodded, his heart full. "I did. And you were right, every great story has struggles." The old man chuckled. "And what did you learn from yours?" Daniel thought for a moment before replying. "That failure isn't the opposite of success, it's part of it. That resilience is built in the moments when you want to quit but don't. And that the hardest times in life often lead to the most unexpected opportunities." Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Sounds like you've written quite the story yourself." As Daniel looked around the bookstore, he saw a younger version of himself in a boy browsing the shelves, uncertainty in his eyes. He smiled, knowing that just as he had been guided, he would now have the chance to pass on what he had learned. Because wisdom, once gained, was meant to be shared. The morning sun bathed the city in golden light as Emma stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd gathered before her. Just a year ago, she had been lost, drowning in self-doubt and uncertainty, but today, she stood as a symbol of resilience, kindness, and transformation. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "A year ago," she began, "I was at my lowest point. I had lost my job, my confidence, and the belief that I was capable of more. I felt like life had closed every door on me, and for a while, I let that define me." She paused, scanning the audience. Some faces were curious, some expectant, but many held that same look she had once worn, the look of someone searching for hope. But then something changed, she continued. "Not my circumstances, not overnight success, but my perspective. I realized that the struggles I faced weren't meant to break me. They were shaping me into someone stronger, someone who refused to give up." She shared how she had started small, choosing to believe in herself when no one else did. How she volunteered at a local shelter, realizing that even when she had nothing, she still had the power to give. How that simple act of kindness reignited a spark in her, showing her that purpose isn't always found in grand achievements but in small moments of impact. Emma talked about the late nights she spent learning new skills, the rejection she faced, and how she kept going despite the setbacks. She spoke of the day she finally got a job she loved, not because she was lucky, but because she had built herself into the person who was ready for it. And now, she said, her voice steady with conviction, I stand here today, not as someone who had an easy journey, but as someone who chose not to quit. And if I can do it, so can you. The crowd erupted in applause, but more importantly, Emma could see something shift in their eyes: hope, determination, and belief. As she stepped down from the stage, a young woman approached her, hesitating for a moment before speaking. Your story, it's exactly what I needed to hear. I've been struggling, but now I feel like maybe I can change things too. Emma smiled, her heart full. You can. The power to transform your life is already within you. As she walked away, she knew this was just the beginning. Not just for her, but for everyone who had listened. Because transformation wasn't just about one person's journey, it was about inspiring others to believe in their own.